Tonight, PHP 8, what's new? Who am I? Developer at Jump 24, working with Laravel, Kite PHP using test-driven development. What am I doing here? Ollie asked me back for some reason. We're currently hiring for a full stack developer and a PHP developer. So we're hiring UK-wide. Anybody that's interested, get in touch with me or the company and we can certainly have a chat about the roles. They're up on our website, jump24.co.uk. So let's start with the fun bits, the new features of PHP 8. The first one is union types. This is something that is both a godsend and an issue in the same way. So we can now do unionized types, which allow us to have more than one type for both a parameter and a return, which is great for legacy apps where that happens. But generally at Jump, we'd stick to a single type wherever possible. So for us, it's a bit of a problem that it exists because it means that more people will be doing it. Void cannot be part of a union type. Nullable types can be done as both string/null or question mark string. The key thing of this is you can change types to almost an infinite level. But obviously, the more types you add, the more chance you have of things not being what you expect and adding more complexity to your code. So just be aware that union types are good, but avoid using them wherever possible. The next one is the null coalescence upgrade. So we've all seen null coalescence done with the question mark and the colon. So in this example, we'd have the start date, we'd get the start date, we'd check if start date is null. If it is, return start date as datetime string or return null. This got an upgrade with null safe. You can now do this directly with function calls. So all you do is question mark and arrow, and this will work in exactly the same way as null coalesce. So this works specifically for function calls. So in this case, booking get start date. If it's null, don't carry on. If it isn't null, carry on and return that. In this case, returning null string, so using the union type. This cannot be used to write data. It can only read data. And it also does not work with arrays, so you couldn't do this to check whether a key exists in an array. It can also be changed, so you could do multiple depths of this. So you could do booking, then use the question mark arrow, get start date, question mark arrow as date time string, and it will return null at the first point that it finds that the item is null. The next one is named arguments. This is surprisingly useful, particularly for things like data transfer objects. When I first saw this, I didn't quite get how this could be used. So in this instance, we've got 4 different numbers and returning A plus B plus C plus D. C is an optional, D is also optional. In this case, you can reorder things. So you could return A, D, and B. You can skip over optional parameters. It's quite useful for DTOs where you have several optionals. It's also fairly useful for when you're building up large constructors or large functions with multiple arguments. So you do have the ability to reorder parameters. You don't have to follow the order that your parameters are for the function. As I said, you can skip over optional parameters. You can use ordered and named together. You can't have an ordered argument after a named one though. And you can use the spread operator with named arguments. So your keys for the array become the argument names. You can't have unrecognized arguments or miss any required arguments though. Attributes. This one is another one of those things that I didn't quite understand when I first looked at it. Attributes is a way of defining the metadata that you want to pass in for a variable. So in this case, we've just got example attribute and being passed in on the variable bar. A common one that's in use is in PHP Storm. They've added in the array shape attribute, which is brilliant for helping you to define the shape of an array within a function. So if you've got quite a lengthy function, you can use the array shape attribute to be able to pull out keys that you expect to be there. So as I said, they're used to pass metadata. They're not designed to be used, nor can they be used for argument validation. So you can't use it as a replacement for validating that your arguments are correct. The attribute you make must also be annotated. So you can create your own attributes. And if you make an attribute class, it must have the attribute declared within the class. So the next one is an alternative to switch. So we've all seen these lengthy switch statements. So in this case, we have 5 possible returns and a default. We're returning 1, 2, many, and lots. You can see that these are quite lengthy to read and understand. PHP 8 has added us an alternative to this, which is match. Match would do the same thing like this. So that is exactly the same return type, exactly the same code written slightly differently. Match will not do type coercion, and unmatched values will throw an error. So in other words, always include a default, even if that default throws an exception. That is actually a very useful thing of match, that you can use this to throw exceptions for varying different returns. You can have returns of different types. And as you can see there with 3, 4, and 5, you can chain them together with commas separating them. Property promotion. We were actually just talking about this one before the talk. We've all seen constructors where we have the public strings and the public arrays before the constructor. We then pass in a variable, then we have to assign the variable that we're passing into the constructor to the public string using this first name, this last name in the example. With property promotion, this changes slightly to become that. So you don't need to declare the public string at the top of the class. You also don't need to do anything to assign it. It's a useful little feature, but at the moment, only simple defaults are allowed. So last name Miller is allowed, for example, but last name, new last name isn't. You can also override things with the constructor body. So you can do public string first name, and then within the body of the constructor, override that with other alternatives and changes that you might want to make. So small improvements that have been included this time with PHP 8. We now have a static return type, which is amazingly useful. It makes it very clear exactly what you're returning. You have the mixed type for those occasions where you just don't know what's being returned or what's being passed in. Throw is now an expression, not a statement. So as I said, that can be used in many more places within PHP 8. Private inheritance checks now throw an error, which is brilliant, because that means that you can catch those errors should you be doing that wrong within code, and you'll be able to handle that error differently. Class is now allowed on an object, so you can create an object with a class property and use that elsewhere. Trailing commas are allowed in parameter lists, which sounds like something that isn't really that useful, but for resolving occasional merge conflicts, believe it or not, a trailing comma often solves those merge conflicts simply because it knows to carry on rather than to try and change things. The stringable interface allows you to create a toString automatically. So you just apply stringable interface to something and you have a toString function built in. Datetime objects can be created from an interface. So you can now create a datetime interface instead of just datetime. There's 3 additions for string functions. String contains, which does exactly what you'd think it does. Checks whether a string contains the text that you pass in. String starts with checks whether the string starts with, and string ends with checks whether the string ends with. Abstract function signatures are now validated fully. That one, I didn't fully understand this again when I first started looking at it, but from my understanding, abstract functions were not properly validated. So you could have things within abstract functions that meant your signatures within the classes that then implemented those abstracts that were different to the initial abstract function. That's now a much cleaner validation and must match as closely as it would if it was an interface. XJSON is now pre-compiled in PHP, so in other words, it's included from the start. There's been a few changes to error reporting. I say a few. There's been a lot of changes. So we now have undefined variable. This is an error instead of a notice. Undefined array index now passes warning instead of a notice. Divide by 0 is an exception instead of a warning. Attempt to increment or decrement property of a non-object is now an exception instead of a warning. Attempt to modify property of non-object exception instead of warning. Attempt to assign is an exception instead of a warning. And creating default object from empty value is an exception instead of a warning. Trying to get property of non-object, undefined property of non-object, and cannot add element to the array as the next element is already occupied. The first 2 are notices. The array one is an exception instead of a warning. Cannot unset offset in non-array variable is now an exception. Cannot use a scalar value as an array is an exception. Only arrays and traversables can be unpacked is now a type error instead of a warning. Illegal offset is a type error instead of warning. Invalid arguments applied for each is now an exception instead of a warning, and that one actually caught me out on a project recently, so I had to make a change to bring the project up to PHP 8. Illegal offset type is exception. Illegal offset in unset is exception. Array to string conversion is now a warning instead of a notice. Resource ID used as offset, casting to integer is now a warning. Uninitialized string offset is a warning. Cannot assign an empty string to a string offset is an exception. Supplied resource is not a valid stream resource, it's now a type error. That one is quite a significant change, and again can quite often create problems within code if you've not handled file streams correctly. And type error is now thrown by many more internal functions. Previously, it was just an error. It is now specifically a type error, which means that you've got more cases to handle type error specifically. So the at operator no longer silences fatal errors. Good, because that was a bad thing anyway. Fatal errors are never a good thing to hide. I've seen code recently that's been written using the at operator to silence errors, and the fatal errors were being hidden by the at operator, and some of those fatal errors were actually errors that should have been dealt with that were in the end leaking PII data to a public place, but because they weren't handling those fatal errors, they weren't seeing that and weren't seeing the issues surrounding that. The default error level is now EALL, so you'll see a lot more errors reported, but again, that's a good thing. With PHP 8, you will start seeing these errors cropping up in logs and cropping up on screen if you haven't handled errors correctly. But if you have built from PHP 7 and handled the deprecations in PHP 7 rather than trying to handle them all at PHP 8 upgrade, it won't be anywhere near as bad as you might think. We have chosen to leave it at EAL on our projects because we prefer to handle every error, even if it is just a notice error. We'd rather know that there's a problem and resolve that and look at the code rather than just hide the errors. The default PDO error is now error exception. So SQL errors will now throw exceptions, which again is a good thing because this will help towards preventing SQL injection errors just by making simple mistakes. It will help towards making sure that SQL requests are being correctly written for the database that you're using. It's an interesting one to see in action that it throws an exception on these, because previously everybody has been used to this just going, something went wrong and carrying on. Now, if you haven't handled these exceptions, your code will break at the point of the database call rather than after a failed database call. PHP now has just-in-time compilation. There's a whole other talk here. I haven't yet written it, but long story short, it's really nice, but the vast majority of people using PHP won't see a benefit from this. So the reason people won't see a benefit is because JIT is primarily focused at repetitive tasks and seeing things that are done over and over that are rapidly compiled the first time, but then re-executed. In most web applications, we don't see that. What we actually see is sort of one-shot hits. There is slight improvement on execution time for the same code. We're seeing maybe 1%, if that, improvement on web apps where you're doing more repetitive tasks. There is a talk out there, and I'll tweet the link to this afterwards, of a gentleman who has gone through the JIT and used rendering a fractal as an example of the improvement. So written exactly the same code in PHP 7, moved it up to PHP 8, run it through and seen a 45% increase. And that's where the JIT comes into its own when you're doing that kind of high level repetitive task. So as you can see, there's a heck of a lot gone into PHP 8 and a heck of a lot that has changed around how you would handle errors that you've seen before. For those of you that were around last time, you'll know that our standards include PHP Stan and will include Enlighten, will include Linter. All of these things are either upgraded or are in the process of being upgraded to be PHP 8 compatible. Linter is already beginning to pick up on many of the PHP 8 errors. And PHP Stan is fast improving its recognition. I understand SARM are also bordering on being ready to release a PHP 8 fully compliant version over the next few weeks. So I'm going to leave a fair bit of time here for some questions, simply because PHP 8 is so new and I could well have missed things that people have heard about, or you may want me to go into more depth on any of the new features.
Cool. Thanks so much. Yeah, there's a lot of changes in there, right?
Yeah.
See. Yeah. So as you said, I think as you sort of alluding to, is your plan to sort of upgrade to 7.4, fix any sort of deprecations there before moving to 8? Is that how you said you're going to approach it, or was I misunderstand that?
Where that's possible, yes, we'll fix deprecations in 7. As a general rule, we won't use deprecated functions anyway, but obviously in agency work, you'll inherit apps from other people. And we have had some apps that we've inherited that were originally built on 5, then upgraded to 7 to resolve a security issue. And there just wasn't time at that point to upgrade the whole thing and do all of the deprecations. So now with that one, we've had to go through and resolve them. I think it was about 40 pull requests on that to resolve all of the different deprecations across the project. But it's interesting to see that it is making a difference to how understandable the code is, and making a difference to what we can actually implement with this, even in a framework that we're not overly keen on personally.
Anybody else wants to unmute and ask a question or any comments or
I'd,
post them in the
I'd
chat?
I'd love to ask a question. As we talked about earlier, I'm a C# developer now by trade, ex PHP. What would you say is the main killer feature of 8 then over 7? What do you think people are, because we've talked about just-in-time compiler, or just in time. What would you say is the one thing that's going to benefit people the most?
So it's a combination of 2 features at once: the property promotion and the union types. Those 2 combined, if done in the right way, is going to make it so much easier to handle older applications and still rely on strong enough typing to be able to make sensible use of attributes. I mean, in one case, we've been able to remove about 40 lines of code that was just checking what type is this, does it fit within this range, and all this, that, and the other, when actually constructor promotion meant we could delete a load of lines that were just passing things in, and then union types meant we knew whether it was an integer or a string, and it couldn't have been anything else.
Cool. Yeah, nice.
Chris, so thanks for the talk. The attributes, I must be honest, I just don't understand what they're for or their purpose. So I don't know if there's a different way to explain it. I've read over it a few times. Out of everything, all the other features I read about, they're great. I just don't quite get them. I don't know if it's just me, but yeah.
No, it's not. I still don't fully understand it myself entirely. The basic principle is that it allows you to define your own concept of what an item is that's being passed in. So array shape is one that was written by JetBrains, couldn't think of their name for a minute. That one will allow you to pass in an attribute that then says this array has a string called first name, a string called last name, an integer called age, and a date called date of birth. By being able to do that, you then have stronger control over the types beneath that. You could sort of do that with dot blocks previously, but attributes make it much cleaner to do that. We haven't really put much into use yet from attributes, simply because we're still trying to work out the best way of using them within our company. For us, data transfer objects seem to be a better option, but it almost feels like a step in the middle for somebody who isn't using strong control over typing. Oh, okay, so maybe I can do this that'll help me a bit to understand what's going on. I mean, as we know, PHP doesn't actually require us to have a type for any variable.
And so it's actually more of a helper for your IDE rather than it is for an actual part of the yeah. So that, okay, yeah. So it's the same like doc blocks, pretty much. It doesn't serve a purpose.
Yeah, it's pretty much for the IDE. It's not used for validation. It does not execute that anywhere other than just to call it in and allow you to define it. But yeah, I mean, using DTOs within Laravel just makes it so much cleaner anyway.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. No, thanks. Okay, well, then that makes more sense, because I read the blog article from Brent, from Spatty,
Mhm.
and he did a whole thing on that, and I just didn't get it what he was trying to. And normally he's pretty good, but yeah, I just said no. Okay, but thanks. That makes more sense. Yeah, so there's been a lot of nice features. I must say, it's 8 is certainly got some good ones, and I know in 8.1 there's that enum type coming now, which should
Yes.
be quite exciting. I think that'll be pretty revolutionary as well.
Yeah, that enum one we're really looking forward to.
Yeah.
That one that Oliver has just shared is actually a good article on helping to explain attributes.
Okay, cool. Thanks. I'll look through that.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. That's Symfony 5.2 have added attribute support. So they're sort of using it in place of doing annotation. So rather than saying at root and then declaring your root path and the name there's some examples there of how they're doing it with annotations instead, with attributes instead. So it's quite interesting. But yeah, I don't fully get them either yet.
I'm sure one of us will work them out eventually.
Mm-hmm.
I'm
yeah,
surprised you didn't say the biggest feature of 8 is the string contains function.
Yeah.
How long I've been waiting for that? Huh?
But for me, they came from JavaScript, so I'm used to regex, and I can do it in regex just as quickly. But I can understand why a lot of people like it. It's much quicker to write string contains than it is to write a regex.
People have died using regex. Let's just put that out there.
Just looking for a talk for PHP Oxford. Coming to go, and the other talk on the night was on the enums being added into PHP 8. So that was a really good talk. I'm going to try and find the link for that in the chat. I'll put it in the chat and in Slack as well. Anybody else got anything? I don't. Feel free to post anything in the chat or Slack or. Yeah, I'm looking. I saw some tweets about using the constructor promotion stuff and essentially making that body, the constructor body, optional if you don't use it. So I think that would be quite nice. I think if that's going to become a thing.
It'd be nice, but I don't think that RFC is going to get accepted. I just have a feeling that it won't get accepted because there's too many people that want to keep it because it breaks the concept of functions having to have the body. I mean, my personal opinion is there's literally no need for those 2 lines with 2 brackets on them.
Yeah, I think I saw the one that was multi-line arrow functions. I think that was going through a debate, and I think it got refused. There's some discussion around it quite recently. It's quite interesting to see how this all sort of works behind the scenes, and yeah, it'd be nice to see what comes in the newer versions now. Okay, any more? Shall we hand over to Matt?
Looks like we're
Nope.
handing over to
Okay,
Matt.
thanks, Christopher. Thanks very much. Really, thank you again for coming to give us another talk for us.
No problem.
Good.